There is a road in Louisiana that most Americans have never heard of. It winds along the Cane River, past crumbling brick columns and ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The air hangs heavy and warm, thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and the quiet hum of cicadas singing through the summer heat. And if you walk this road at twilight, when the shadows stretch long across the cotton fields, you might see something that stops you cold. A plantation house, grand, elegant, built in the French colonial style with wide galleries and tall windows that once looked out over thousands of acres of fertile land. But here is what the history books forgot to mention. The family who built this empire, who commanded this wealth, who walked these halls as masters of all they surveyed, they were black. This is the story that America buried. The forgotten chapter of a nation built on contradictions. Because long before the Civil War tore this country apart, long before the great debates about slavery and freedom divided families and states, there existed a world most people cannot imagine. A world where free black men and women accumulated fortunes that rivaled the wealthiest white planters. A world where former slaves became slaveholders themselves. A world so morally complex, so deeply troubling, that historians have struggled for generations to explain it. And yet it happened. Not once, not twice, but hundreds of times across the American South. These are their stories. To understand how such a world could exist, we must first travel back to a time when the boundaries between freedom and bondage were not as clear as we imagine today. In the decades following the American Revolution, the southern states contained a population that few people talk about anymore. They were called free people of color, and their numbers grew steadily through the late 1700s and early 1800s. Some had been freed by masters who felt guilt over the institution of slavery. Others had purchased their own freedom through years of labor and saving. Still others were the children of white fathers and enslaved mothers, granted liberty and sometimes inheritance by men who could not publicly acknowledge their own blood. In Louisiana especially, this population flourished. The territory had changed hands multiple times, passing from France to Spain to France again, before finally becoming American in 1803. Each colonial power had left its mark, including a tradition known as plaçage, an arrangement where wealthy white men took free women of color as companions, providing for them and their children, even while maintaining separate white families. The result was a distinct class of mixed-race individuals who inherited property, education, and social standing. They were not white. They could never be white. But they were certainly not enslaved. They existed in a twilight zone between two worlds, and some of them became extraordinarily wealthy. The story of the Matoyer family begins with a woman named Marie-Thérèse, known to history as Coin. She was born into slavery around 1742 on a plantation near Natchitoches, Louisiana. Even as a young girl, she displayed an intelligence and determination that set her apart. She learned to speak French, Spanish, and the languages of local native tribes. She understood trade, agriculture, and the complex social dynamics of colonial Louisiana. And in her early 20s, she caught the attention of a French merchant named Claude Thomas Pierre Matoyer. Claude Matoyer was a recent arrival from France, ambitious and eager to establish himself in the New World. When he met Coin, something shifted in both their lives. He purchased her from her owner, and for the next 20 years, they lived together as husband and wife in all but legal name. Together, they had 10 children. But Louisiana law forbade marriage between races, and Claude's family in France expected him to take a proper white wife. Eventually, that pressure became too great. In 1786, Claude married a French woman, ending his relationship with Coin. Yet he did not abandon her. Instead, Claude granted Coin her freedom and gave her a small plot of land along the Cane River. She was in her 40s, a formerly enslaved woman with nothing but 68 acres and her own fierce will to survive. What she did next would echo through generations. Coin worked her land with relentless determination. She planted tobacco. She trapped bears and sold their grease to merchants in New Orleans. She raised cattle and traded furs with nearby native communities. Slowly, acre by acre, she expanded her holdings. And then, with the money she earned, she began doing something that reveals the moral complexity at the heart of this story. She started buying her own children out of slavery. One by one, Coin purchased the freedom of the children she had been forced to leave behind when Claude granted her liberty. Some had been sold to other plantations. Others remained with their original owners. Each transaction required months of negotiation and sums of money that would take years to accumulate. But she never stopped. By the time she died around 1816, Coin had freed not only her own children, but several of her grandchildren as well. She left behind nearly 1,000 acres of Louisiana farmland, and her descendants, the Matoyers, were just getting started. The eldest son, Augustin Matoyer, inherited his mother's ambition along with her land. But where Coin had struggled to survive, Augustin built an empire. By 1830, he owned nearly 12,000 acres along the Cane River. His plantation, Melrose, became one of the most productive cotton operations in the entire region. The big house still stands today, a testament to both his success and the troubling compromises that made it possible. Because Augustin Matoyer did not work, those 12,000 acres alone. At the height of his wealth, he owned more than 200 enslaved people. Here is where the comfortable narratives of American history begin to crack. We want our heroes pure and our villains obvious. We want slavery to be a story of black suffering and white cruelty, with clean lines between the oppressed and the oppressors. But the Matoyers do not fit that story. They were black. They were once enslaved or descended from enslaved people. And they became slaveholders themselves, not out of some noble desire to protect family members, but as a business decision, a path to wealth in an economy that ran on human bondage. The cotton they grew, the sugar some of them refined, the fortunes they accumulated. All of it was built on the same brutal system that had once held their ancestors in chains. By 1830, the Matoyer family collectively owned more enslaved people than any other black family in America. Their plantation homes rivaled those of the wealthiest white planters. They sent their children to be educated in France. They commissioned portraits, accumulated libraries, and built a church that still serves the community today. The Church of St. Augustine, constructed in 1829 with Matoyer money, stands as one of the oldest black Catholic churches in the United States. Its weathered brick walls have witnessed nearly 2 centuries of worship, baptism, marriage, and mourning. And yet those same walls were built by enslaved hands, directed by black masters who saw no contradiction in their faith and their fortune. The moral arithmetic of slavery in Louisiana operated by rules that seem incomprehensible today. State law actually made it difficult for slaveholders to free enslaved people. Manumission, as the legal process was called, required court approval, and courts increasingly denied such requests as the 1800s progressed. This meant that some black slaveholders genuinely could not free the people they had purchased, even when they wanted to. Family members bought out of bondage sometimes remained legally enslaved because no judge would grant their freedom. But this was not the whole story. The Matoyers and families like them also purchased enslaved people who were strangers, workers bought purely for their labor value. These were not rescue missions. They were business transactions. The historian Michael P. Johnson spent decades trying to understand this world. His research revealed that by 1830, there were more than 3,000 free black slaveholders in the United States, owning collectively nearly 13,000 enslaved people. Most held fewer than 5, and many of these were indeed family members trapped by legal obstacles to freedom. But a significant minority were large-scale planters whose operations differed from white slaveholders only in the color of the master's skin. They bought and sold human beings at auction. They used overseers and punishment to maintain discipline. They profited from the same brutal calculus that turned people into property and labor into wealth. William Ellison of South Carolina stands as perhaps the most striking example. Born into slavery around 1790 in the Fairfield district of South Carolina, he was originally named April. His father was almost certainly his white master, William Ellison Sr., who owned a cotton plantation. Young April showed unusual mechanical aptitude from childhood. He could take apart and reassemble anything. He understood gears, levers, and the complex machinery that was transforming Southern agriculture. His master recognized this talent and apprenticed him to a cotton gin maker, a decision that would change both their fortunes. Cotton gins were essential technology in the early 1800s. Eli Whitney's invention had made short staple cotton profitable, but the machines required constant maintenance and skilled repair. April learned every aspect of the trade. He could build a gin from scratch, repair broken parts, and improve designs to process cotton faster. By his late 20s, he had become so valuable that his master faced a choice. He could keep April enslaved and benefit from his skills, or he could allow this talented man to purchase his own freedom. In 1816, April did exactly that. He paid $800, a fortune at the time, earned from making and repairing cotton gins in whatever hours remained after his enslaved labor. He took his former master's name, becoming William Ellison, and began building his own cotton gin manufacturing business. Within a decade, William Ellison had become one of the most successful businessmen in South Carolina, black or white. Planters from across the state brought their cotton gins to his workshop in Statesburg. His reputation for quality work spread throughout the region. He bought land, first a few acres, then dozens, then hundreds. By 1840, he owned more than 300 acres of prime cotton land, and he owned enslaved people to work it. By 1860, just before the Civil War, William Ellison held 63 enslaved people, making him one of the largest black slaveholders in the entire South. What made William Ellison particularly troubling to later generations was his apparent embrace of the slave system. He did not simply inherit enslaved workers or purchase family members. He bought, sold, and traded human beings as business assets. Court records show him pursuing runaway enslaved people with the same determination as any white planter. He separated families when it suited his economic interests. He accumulated wealth not despite slavery, but because of it, using the same methods and moral justifications employed by his white neighbors. When the Civil War began, Ellison's sons volunteered to serve the Confederacy, fighting to preserve the institution that had once enslaved their father. The Ellison story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and moral compromise. How could a man who had experienced bondage, who knew its brutality firsthand, become a brutal master himself? Was it simply greed? Was it survival? The desperate need to accumulate enough wealth and power that no one could ever enslave him again? Or was it something darker, a kind of moral blindness that allowed him to see his own suffering as unique while dismissing the suffering of others? These questions have no easy answers. They reveal the ways that systems of oppression corrupt everyone they touch, victim and perpetrator alike. Andrew Durnford of Louisiana presents yet another variation on this troubling theme. Born around 1780 to a white Scottish immigrant father and a free woman of color mother, Durnford grew up with advantages that most black people in Louisiana could never imagine. His father acknowledged him, educated him, and left him substantial property. By his 30s, Durnford had established himself as a sugar planter on St. Rosalie Plantation in Plaquemines Parish. Sugar cultivation was even more labor-intensive than cotton, requiring gangs of workers to cut cane, process it quickly before spoilage, and maintain the complex machinery of the sugar mill. At his peak, Andrew Durnford owned more than 70 enslaved people. What makes Durnford's story particularly complex is the extensive correspondence he left behind. His letters reveal a man who struggled with the contradictions of his position. He expressed genuine affection for individual enslaved people, while simultaneously treating them as property. He worried about their health and welfare one moment, then calculated their market value the next. In one letter, he described his attachment to certain enslaved workers. In another, he discussed selling a woman away from her children because she had become troublesome. The cognitive dissonance is breathtaking, and yet Durnford was not unique. He was simply more articulate about the mental gymnastics required to be a slaveholder with a conscience. Durnford also left records of a friendship with John McDonough, a wealthy white planter who developed an elaborate scheme to gradually free his enslaved workers by allowing them to purchase their freedom over 15 years. McDonough presented this as progressive and enlightened. The enslaved people would learn the value of work and saving. They would earn their liberty through their own efforts. They would be grateful rather than resentful when freedom finally came. In practice, the system extracted additional years of labor from people who had already given their lives to bondage. Durnford admired McDonough's approach and considered implementing something similar. Yet he never did. The economics of sugar planting made such schemes impractical, and Andrew Durnford, whatever his private doubts, was first and always a businessman. The free black planter class reached its peak in the Iowa 1850s, the decade before the Civil War. By then, the combined wealth of black slaveholders in Louisiana alone exceeded several $1 million, an astronomical sum in that era. They owned some of the finest plantation homes in the state. They traveled to Paris and New Orleans, educated their children in the best schools, and cultivated a refinement that matched or exceeded their white neighbors. And they lived in constant fear, because the system that had made their wealth possible was turning against them. As the debate over slavery intensified, white Southerners grew increasingly suspicious of all free black people. They represented a dangerous contradiction, living proof that black people could be successful, educated, and independent. State legislatures passed ever more restrictive laws. Free people of color faced curfews, registration requirements, and bans on certain occupations. They could not testify against whites in court. They could not vote or hold office. They existed at the pleasure of their white neighbors, their freedom always conditional, always revocable. The Matoyers felt this pressure acutely. In the 1850s, Louisiana passed laws requiring all free black people who had arrived after 1825 to leave the state. Though this technically exempted the Matoyers, who had lived along the Cane River for generations. It created an atmosphere of persecution and fear. Some family members considered emigrating to Mexico or Haiti, places where their skin color would not mark them as perpetual outsiders. Others dug in, determined to hold on to the land and wealth their grandmother Coin had sacrificed so much to build. They had no way of knowing that within a decade, everything would change. The wealth of black planters was built on a foundation that could not survive the coming conflict. They had accumulated property and human beings, and that property was about to be rendered worthless. They had allied themselves, however uneasily, with a slave power that would soon be destroyed. They had created fortunes within a system that could not imagine them as full participants, and when that system collapsed, they would discover just how fragile their position had always been. But before the fall came the final flowering. In the years just before the Civil War, the great houses of the Matoyers stood in splendor along the Cane River. Melrose Plantation, with its grand columns and French doors, welcomed visitors to soirees where the finest wines accompanied conversations in French and English. The family library contained hundreds of volumes, many imported from Paris. Children practiced piano in drawing rooms decorated with furniture from New Orleans craftsmen. Enslaved servants moved silently through these spaces, serving the same meals, performing the same labor, suffering the same bondage as their counterparts on white-owned plantations nearby. The only difference was the color of the hand that held the whip. William Ellison had built his own mansion by 1850, a fine home that still stands in Statesburg, South Carolina. He had transformed himself from enslaved mechanic to wealthy planter and respected businessman. His cotton gin workshop employed both free and enslaved workers, turning out machines that processed the harvest of neighboring plantations. He belonged to the same Episcopal church as the wealthiest white families in the area, sitting in a pew that proclaimed his status to all who entered. His children and grandchildren would carry his name into the uncertain future, unaware that everything they had built was about to be swept away. Andrew Durnford died in 1859, just 2 years before the war began. He never had to witness the destruction of everything he had created. But his heirs watched as federal gunboats steamed up the Mississippi, as Union armies marched through Louisiana, as the enslaved people who had built his sugar empire walked away into freedom. The plantation system that had made men like Durnford wealthy collapsed with breathtaking speed, and the black planter class collapsed with it. What happened next reveals just how precarious their position had always been. When the war ended and Reconstruction began, the former black slaveholders found themselves in an impossible situation. They had lost their enslaved labor force, the foundation of their agricultural operations. They had lost much of their property to wartime destruction and confiscation, and they had lost any claim to solidarity with the newly freed black population. The freed people remembered who had owned them. They remembered the whip, the auction block, the families torn apart. They did not distinguish between white masters and black masters when it came to settling accounts. The Matoyer family struggled to maintain their holdings in the chaotic years after the war. Some members had supported the Confederacy, believing that their interests lay with the planter class regardless of race. Others had quietly hoped for Union victory, sensing that the old order could not survive and might be replaced by something better. Either way, they faced a transformed world that had no place for them. The great plantations broke apart. Land that had been worked by hundreds of enslaved people could not be profitably farmed without their labor. Former slaveholders, black and white alike, tried various arrangements, sharecropping, tenant farming, wage labor, none of which generated the wealth of the old system. The Matoyer fortune dwindled year by year. Grand houses fell into disrepair. Libraries were sold off volume by volume. The elegant clothes and fine furniture gave way to practical necessities. Within a generation, the wealthiest black family in American history had become just another struggling community in rural Louisiana. And then something even stranger happened. The memory itself began to disappear. White historians had no interest in preserving the story of black slaveholders. It complicated their narrative of benevolent masters and grateful slaves. Black historians, emerging in the late 1800s and early 1900s, likewise avoided the topic. It contradicted their narrative of unified black resistance and suffering. The complex truth that some black people had been oppressors as well as oppressed, that wealth and status could corrupt regardless of race, that the boundaries between victim and perpetrator were never as clear as we wanted them to be. This truth was simply too uncomfortable for anyone to tell. The plantation houses crumbled. The records moldered in courthouse basements. The oral histories passed down through families became fragmentary and confused. By the mid-20th century, most Americans had never heard of Coin or the Matoyers, of William Ellison or Andrew Durnford. The forgotten story of black plantation owners had been buried so thoroughly that it seemed never to have existed at all. But nothing is ever truly forgotten. In dusty archives, the records waited. In crumbling cemeteries, the tombstones held their secrets. Along the Cane River, descendants of the Matoyers still lived on fragments of the land their ancestors had farmed. And slowly, carefully, historians began to piece together what had been lost. The story they uncovered challenges everything we think we know about race, wealth, and morality in American history. It forces us to ask whether freedom and justice are the same thing, whether escaping oppression absolves us of participating in it, whether wealth accumulated through evil means can ever be redeemed. These are not comfortable questions. They do not yield comfortable answers. But they are the questions that the forgotten black planters left behind, inscribed in deed records and court documents, in plantation ledgers and personal correspondence, in the very landscape of the American South. And their story is not over, because the mansions are still standing, the land is still there. The descendants still remember, however imperfectly, the strange and troubling legacy of their ancestors. The forgotten story is being remembered again, not to celebrate or condemn, but simply to understand. What comes next will reveal the full scope of what was lost and what might still be recovered. The Civil War did not simply end slavery. It destroyed a world, including the world of black slaveholders who had built their fortunes on its foundations. But destruction is never total. Something always survives. And in the ruins of the Old South, the remnants of that forgotten world still wait to tell their story. The guns fell silent in 1865. Across the American South, a world built on bondage collapsed into chaos and uncertainty. 4 million people who had been property on Monday were free by Friday. Plantations that had hummed with forced labor suddenly stood empty, their fields untended, their big houses echoing with absence. And among the ruins walked figures that history would soon forget. The black planters who had built fortunes on slavery now faced a reckoning that no amount of wealth could postpone. The Matoyer family gathered at Melrose Plantation in those first bewildering months after surrender. The grand house still stood, its columns and galleries intact, but everything that had given it meaning had vanished. The enslaved workers who had planted and harvested the cotton were gone, walking away to uncertain freedom. The markets that had purchased that cotton were disrupted by war and blockade. The social order that had placed the Matoyers above other black people, that precious distinction between free and enslaved, had been erased by emancipation. Now they were simply black, in a South that was about to make that designation more dangerous than ever before. Louis Matoyer, one of Augustine's grandsons, kept a journal during these years. His entries reveal a man struggling to comprehend a transformed world. He wrote of former slaves who refused to work for wages, preferring to farm their own small plots of land. He complained of federal soldiers who treated him with the same suspicion they directed at white planters. He mourned the loss of the old order, never quite acknowledging the moral rot at its foundation. To Louis Matoyer, the end of slavery was not liberation, but catastrophe. He could not see beyond his own loss to recognize the freedom of others. This blindness would cost the Matoyers dearly. The newly freed black population remembered who had held them in bondage. They remembered the overseer's whip, the auction block's terror, the children sold away and never seen again. They made no distinction between masters based on color. A black man who had owned slaves was still a slaveholder, still complicit in the great crime that had defined their lives. When Reconstruction brought black men to political power for the first time, the former black slaveholders found themselves isolated. They were not white enough for white society. They were not trusted by the freed people. They belonged nowhere. The economics of this new world were equally unforgiving. Plantation agriculture required massive labor forces working under strict discipline. Without slavery, that model could not survive. The Matoyers tried hiring former slaves as wage workers, but too few would accept. They tried sharecropping arrangements, but the returns were meager compared to the old days. They tried switching crops, diversifying their operations, selling off parcels of land to raise cash. Nothing worked. Year by year, the great estate shrank. The library was sold. The fine furniture went to creditors. The 1,000 acres coin had accumulated dwindled to hundreds, then to dozens. By 1880, the Matoyer fortune had essentially vanished. The family still owned Melrose and a few surrounding acres, but they were farmers now, not planters. They worked their own land with their own hands, something their grandparents would have considered unthinkable. The big house remained, a reminder of glories past, but there was no money to maintain it. Paint peeled from the columns. The roof leaked in heavy rains. The gardens that had once rivaled those of European estates grew wild with weeds and brambles. William Ellison's family faced an even harsher fate. The Ellisons had been more openly aligned with the Confederacy, and that allegiance brought consequences when the war ended. Federal authorities confiscated some of their property. Local freed people, who had long memories and newly acquired political power, made life difficult for the family that had once owned their neighbors. The cotton gin business collapsed along with the plantation economy it had served. By 1870, the Ellisons had lost most of what William had spent a lifetime building. His descendants scattered, some heading north to cities where their history was unknown, others remaining in South Carolina to face the hostility of both races. The story of Andrew Durnford's heirs followed a similar trajectory. St. Rosalie Plantation, once one of the finest sugar operations in Louisiana, could not function without enslaved labor. The complex machinery of sugar production required coordinated gangs of workers willing to labor through the brutal grinding season. Freed people had no desire to return to that hell, not for wages, not for any price. The plantation failed within 5 years of the war's end. The land was sold, subdivided, absorbed into other operations. By 1900, nothing remained to mark Andrew Durnford's existence except some yellowing documents in parish archives. But something strange happened as these families declined. Their story began to disappear, not through accident, but through deliberate erasure. White historians of the late 1800s and early 1900s had no interest in complicating the narrative they were constructing. The lost cause mythology required slavery to be a benevolent institution, paternalistic masters caring for childlike slaves who were content in their bondage. Black slaveholders disrupted this fantasy. They proved that the institution was about money and power, not racial uplift. They demonstrated that brutality transcended color, that the capacity for oppression lived in all hearts regardless of skin. This truth was inconvenient, so it was simply ignored. Black historians of the same era faced different pressures. The emerging narrative of African American history emphasized collective suffering and collective resistance. It told of a people united by oppression, struggling together toward freedom. Black slaveholders complicated this story too. They suggested division within the race, class hierarchies that persisted even under bondage, moral failures that could not be blamed on whites alone. This truth was painful, so it too was suppressed. Neither side wanted to remember the black planters, and so they were forgotten. The forgetting happened in stages. First, the living memory faded. The children and grandchildren of black slaveholders died, taking their first-hand knowledge with them. Their descendants knew family stories, fragments of a confusing past, but the full picture grew hazier with each generation. Second, the physical evidence deteriorated. Plantation houses crumbled without maintenance. Records were lost to fire, flood, and neglect. Cemeteries grew over with vegetation, their tombstones illegible beneath moss and lichen. Third, the institutional memory failed. Schools taught simplified versions of history that left no room for complexity. Museums focused on experiences that fit familiar narratives. Archives preserved some documents, but not others. The selection itself a form of forgetting. By 1950, the black planters had essentially vanished from American memory. Textbooks mentioned slavery as a system that white people imposed on black people, with no acknowledgement of the exceptions. Popular culture depicted the antebellum South in stark black and white, literally and figuratively. Even scholarly works rarely mentioned the phenomenon, and when they did, they often dismissed it as statistically insignificant or morally irrelevant. The few descendants who remembered heard their stories met with disbelief. Surely, people said, no black person would ever own slaves. Surely that could not be true. But the documents remained. In courthouse basements across the South, deed records and tax rolls preserved the names of black slaveholders. In university archives, letters and diaries waited for scholars who might someday ask the right questions. In family Bibles and oral traditions, fragments of the truth survived, passed down through generations who did not always understand what they were preserving. The forgotten story was not destroyed. It was only sleeping, waiting to be awakened. The awakening began in the 1970s, when a new generation of historians started asking uncomfortable questions. They had come of age during the civil rights movement, watching comfortable narratives about race explode in the face of lived experience. They were not satisfied with simple stories of good and evil. They wanted to understand how systems of oppression actually functioned, who benefited, who suffered, and how people navigated the moral complexities of their time. These historians went into the archives with fresh eyes, and what they found astonished them. Michael P. Johnson and James L. Rourke published their groundbreaking study of William Ellison in 1984. Black masters told the full story of the enslaved mechanic who became one of South Carolina's wealthiest planters. The book forced readers to confront the reality of black slaveholding in all its troubling detail. Here was a man who had experienced bondage firsthand, who knew its cruelties intimately, and who nevertheless became a cruel master himself. The authors did not flinch from the moral implications. They presented Ellison as a complex human being, neither hero nor villain, but something more unsettling. A man who made choices within a system of limited options, choices that advanced his own interests at the expense of others. The book sparked controversy, but also opened doors. Suddenly, scholars across the country began examining the phenomenon of black slaveholders. In Louisiana, researchers rediscovered the Matoyer family. Gary B. Mills published The Forgotten People in 1977, reconstructing the story of Coin and her descendants from surviving documents. The book revealed a world that seemed impossible by 20th century standards. A former slave woman accumulating 1,000 acres. Her children building one of the largest planter dynasties in the state. The complexity of race relations in colonial and antebellum Louisiana, where categories we take for granted simply did not apply. Mills wrote with scholarly precision, but also with evident wonder. He had uncovered a lost world, and he wanted readers to see it clearly, even when clarity was uncomfortable. These scholarly works rippled outward into popular consciousness. Documentary filmmakers discovered the story. Journalists wrote features. The descendants of black slaveholders, many of whom had known only fragments of their family history, began piecing together the full picture. Along the Cane River, efforts began to preserve what remained of the Matoyer legacy. Melrose Plantation was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1974, recognized not only for its architecture, but for its significance in African American history. The Cane River Creole National Historical Park, established in 1994, now preserves several Matoyer properties and interprets their complex story for modern visitors. But preservation brought its own complications. How do you tell the story of a place built by enslaved labor, owned by black people who were themselves slaveholders? How do you honor the achievement of Coin without ignoring the suffering of those she and her descendants enslaved? How do you present complexity to visitors who arrive with simple expectations, wanting heroes to admire and villains to condemn? These questions have no easy answers. The interpreters at Cane River sites struggle with them daily, crafting narratives that acknowledge difficulty without wallowing in it, that recognize achievement without celebrating exploitation. The physical restoration of these sites has revealed layers of history that documents alone could not capture. Archaeologists excavating around Melrose Plantation have uncovered the remains of slave cabins, evidence of the daily lives of those whose labor built the Matoyer fortune. They found pottery, tools, religious objects, traces of humanity that the historical record largely ignored. These discoveries force a kind of moral accounting. The beautiful big house with its elegant galleries exists because of those cabins and the people who lived in them. The achievement cannot be separated from the exploitation. They are one story, not two. Similar work has happened in South Carolina, where William Ellison's house still stands in Stateburg. Local historians have documented not only the Ellison family, but also the enslaved people they held. Researchers have traced some of their descendants, connecting modern African American families to ancestors who labored in Ellison's fields and workshop. These connections are complicated. How do you feel about an ancestor who was enslaved by someone who was himself once enslaved? Does shared racial identity create solidarity? Or does the relationship of master and slave override everything else? Different people answer these questions differently, and perhaps that diversity of response is itself the point. The story of black slaveholders also challenges contemporary debates about race, reparations, and historical responsibility. Some have seized on the phenomenon to argue against reparations for slavery, claiming that black complicity in the institution somehow diminishes white responsibility. This argument misunderstands the numbers involved. Black slaveholders were always a tiny minority, their holdings a fraction of the total enslaved population. The system of American slavery was created by white people, maintained by white people, and overwhelmingly benefited white people. The existence of black slaveholders does not change that fundamental reality, but it does complicate simplistic narratives, and that complication has value of its own. Because the truth is always more complicated than we want it to be. Humans are not divided neatly into oppressors and oppressed, heroes and villains. The same person can be victim and perpetrator, sometimes simultaneously. The same family can experience bondage and inflict it. This is not a comfortable truth. It does not lend itself to simple moral judgments or satisfying conclusions. But it is the truth, and pretending otherwise only makes us more vulnerable to the seductions of power and the corruptions of privilege. The descendants of black slaveholders have had to grapple with this complexity in deeply personal ways. Some have embraced the full story, recognizing that their ancestors were products of their time, making choices within constraints they did not create. Others have struggled with shame, feeling implicated in crimes committed generations ago. Still others have used the discovery as an opportunity for reconciliation, reaching out to descendants of the people their ancestors enslaved, acknowledging the harm and seeking to build new relationships. There is no single response, no correct way to inherit a morally complicated past. Each descendant must find their own path. The story also illuminates something essential about how wealth functions in America. The fortunes of the black planters were built on the same foundation as white wealth, the exploitation of human labor. When slavery ended, that foundation collapsed, and the wealth collapsed with it. But white wealth, built on the same foundation, largely survived. Why? Because white slaveholders had access to systems of credit, law, and social connection that black slaveholders did not. They could borrow money to rebuild. They could use legal systems to reclaim property. They could leverage social networks to find new opportunities. The black planters had none of these advantages. Their wealth had always been more precarious, more dependent on a single system, more vulnerable to change. When that system ended, they had no fallback. This pattern continues to shape American society today. Black wealth remains more fragile than white wealth, more concentrated in homes rather than investments, more vulnerable to economic shocks. The median white family has roughly 8 times the wealth of the median black family, a gap that has persisted for decades. The roots of this disparity reach back to slavery and its aftermath, to the different ways that black and white Americans were able to transmit wealth across generations. The black planters, for all their success, were never truly secure. They were permitted to accumulate wealth, but not to keep it. Their story is not ancient history. It is the prologue to the present. Standing at Melrose Plantation today, you can feel the weight of these accumulated meanings. The big house has been restored, its columns repainted, its galleries repaired. Inside, period furnishings evoke the elegance that Augustin Matoyer once commanded. Outside, the grounds stretch toward the Cane River, much as they did 2 centuries ago. It is beautiful, undeniably beautiful, a testament to ambition and achievement. And yet, behind the big house stand smaller structures, reconstructed slave cabins that tell another part of the story. Inside those cabins, interpreters describe lives of forced labor, of families separated, of dreams deferred indefinitely. The beauty of the mansion exists because of the suffering in those cabins. You cannot honestly appreciate one without acknowledging the other. The same duality haunts every site associated with black slaveholders. William Ellison's house in South Carolina is a historic landmark, but its preservation raises the same questions. Do we honor it because it represents black achievement? Or do we question that achievement because it came at such cost? The answer, of course, is yes to both. We must hold multiple truths simultaneously, embracing complexity rather than fleeing from it. This is hard work, emotionally and intellectually demanding. But it is the only way to truly understand the past and its continuing influence on the present. The forgotten story of black plantation owners is finally being remembered. Books have been written, documentaries have been filmed, historic sites have been preserved and interpreted. The descendants have begun to piece together their family histories, connecting with archives and with each other. The deliberate erasure of the past century is slowly being reversed. But remembering is only the first step. Understanding must follow, and understanding requires a willingness to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge for simple judgments, to accept that history is rarely what we wish it had been. What do we learn from this forgotten chapter? We learn that oppression corrupts everyone it touches, that victims can become perpetrators when circumstances change. We learn that wealth in America has always been precarious for black people, subject to seizure by law or violence at any moment. We learn that the boundaries between races were never as fixed as they later became, that the harsh categories of Jim Crow were inventions, not inevitabilities. We learn that moral complexity is not an excuse for inaction, but a demand for deeper engagement. And we learn that forgetting is a choice, one that serves some interests and silences others. The Cane River still flows past lands that Coin once farmed. The oak trees she might have planted still spread their branches over the road. Her descendants still live in the area, some of them, carrying names that echo through 2 centuries of American history. They are teachers and doctors, farmers and business people, ordinary Americans living ordinary lives. Most of them know something of their family story, though the details often blur with time and retelling. They know that their ancestors were something unusual, that the simple categories of American racial history do not quite apply to their lineage. They live with that complexity every day. And perhaps that is the final lesson. We are all living with complexity, all inheriting histories we did not choose, all making decisions within constraints we did not create. The black planters were not monsters. They were people, as flawed and compromised as any of us, navigating a world that offered limited options and demanded impossible choices. They chose wealth over solidarity, comfort over conscience, family over principle. Many people in their position would have chosen the same. Many people in our position, facing different but equally difficult choices, choose similar compromises every day. The story of the black plantation owners does not excuse the crimes of slavery. It does not diminish white responsibility for creating and maintaining that brutal system. It does not suggest that all people are equally culpable or that racial categories are meaningless. What it does is complicate the simple narratives we tell ourselves. forcing us to think harder about how oppression actually functions, how people actually behave, how history actually unfolds. This complication is a gift, however uncomfortable. It makes us better thinkers, better citizens, better human beings. As the sun sets over the Cane River, casting long shadows across fields that once grew cotton and sugar, the ghosts of this forgotten history seem to stir. Coin is there, the enslaved woman who became a landowner, the mother who purchased her own children out of bondage. Augustine is there, her son, the master of Melrose, the owner of 200 human beings. William Ellison is there, the former slave who became a slaveholder, the mechanic who built an empire on other people's backs. They are all there, these complicated ancestors, these troubling predecessors, these forgotten Americans. They ask nothing of us except to be remembered. They demand nothing except that we look honestly at what they did and why. They offer no easy lessons, no comfortable morals, no satisfying conclusions. They offer only the truth of their lives, complex and contradictory, triumphant and tragic. And in that truth, if we are willing to receive it, lies something valuable. A reminder that history is made by human beings, with all our capacity for both greatness and cruelty. A warning that systems of oppression corrupt everyone they touch, victim and perpetrator alike. A hope that even the most buried stories can eventually find their way back to light. The forgotten story of the black families who owned plantations is forgotten no more. It stands now as a testament to the complexity of the American experience, a chapter that cannot be ignored, a truth that demands to be heard. And in the telling and retelling of this story, in the preservation of these sites and the research of these archives, something important happens. We become a little more honest about who we are and where we came from. We become a little more capable of confronting the moral challenges of our own time. We become, perhaps, a little more human. That is the legacy of Coin and her descendants. That is the meaning of Melrose and all the plantation houses like it. That is why this story matters, why it had to be recovered, why it must never be forgotten again. Because in the end, history is not about the past. It is about who we are right now, in this moment, making choices that future generations will judge. The black planters made their choices. Now we must make ours. And perhaps, if we learn from their example, we can choose a little more wisely, a little more justly, a little more humanely than they did. The river keeps flowing. The oaks keep growing. The story keeps being told. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, the ghosts of the forgotten finally rest.